The war was over. We heard it crackle over the radio, a ghost's whisper in our steel tomb. But for us, the 32 men who remained, peace was just a word. Our commander, a man barely older than most of us, offered a choice, a British prison camp, or a voyage to the very edge of the world. We chose the unknown. We chose to become a phantom, a lone steel shark crossing an ocean that wanted us dead, hunted by a world that believed we no longer existed. This is the story of that impossible escape. On May 8, 1945, while the rest of the world uncorked champagne and danced in the streets, the men of U-977 floated in a cold, silent purgatory. Their world was the Holsenøy Fjord in Norway, a granite cage of steep cliffs and dark, still water. The air inside the U-boat was thick with the familiar sense of diesel, sweat, and stale bread. But now a new element had been added, the suffocating aroma of defeat. The voice of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the new leader of a non-existent Reich, had confirmed the rumors. The war was lost. All submarines were to proceed to Allied ports and surrender. For the battle-hardened men of the U-boat arm, the wolves of the sea, it was an order that felt more like a betrayal than a command. Their commander, Oberleutnant Heinz Scheffer, was just 24 years old. But the war had aged him beyond his years. He was a product of the system, trained to fight and die for a cause that had evaporated overnight. Now he was responsible for the lives of nearly 50 men, adrift in a world where their flag was a symbol of disgrace and their very existence a crime. He stared at the surrender order, knowing that obedience meant a barbed wire cage interrogation and an uncertain future as a prisoner of a vengeful enemy. Propaganda, which had been their daily bread for years, painted horrifying pictures of Allied camps and brutal retribution. The fear was palpable. But defiance. Defiance was a leap into an abyss. Their vessel was no elite hunter. U-977 was a Type 7C, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, but she was tired. Used primarily for training, her hull was compromised, her batteries inefficient. She was a battered veteran, being asked to run one last, impossible race against the entire world. Scheffer gathered his men in the claustrophobic confines of the forward torpedo room. There was no space for ceremony. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of a single bulkhead lamp. He laid out the choice with stark simplicity. They could follow Dönitz's order, sail to the nearest British port, and accept their fate as prisoners of war. Or they could make a run for it, a desperate, mad dash to Argentina, a neutral nation thousands of miles away, a place where they might simply disappear and start new lives. He wasn't giving an order. He was asking a question. And in that moment, the rigid hierarchy of the German military dissolved. Every man, from the chief engineer to the youngest seaman, had a voice. The debate was fierce but hushed. The married men spoke of their wives and children, of a desperate need to return home, whatever the cost. They had survived the war. They could survive a prison camp. Others, younger and with nothing left in a shattered Germany, saw only the allure of freedom. The vote was cast. The result split the crew down the middle, a clean, painful fracture. 16 men, the ones with families, chose surrender. 32 chose the abyss. On May 10th, 1945, 2 days after the war in Europe had officially ended, a small group of German sailors stood on the rocky shore of Holsenøy Island. They watched in silence as U-977, their former home, slipped its moorings. There were no cheers, no final salutes, just the quiet hum of electric motors as the submarine glided into the morning mist, becoming a ghost. For the 16 men left behind, the war was over. For the 32 men aboard the ghost ship, it had just begun. The moment the Norwegian coast dissolved into the gray Atlantic fog, U-977 ceased to be a warship of the German Navy. It became a time capsule, a rogue state with a population of 32 governed by one law: do not be seen. Their route south was a gauntlet. The waters between Norway and Iceland were the most heavily patrolled on the planet. A hornet's nest of Allied destroyers and long-range patrol bombers still on high alert. To attempt a surface crossing was suicide. To travel submerged on batteries alone was impossible. Their survival hinged on a single, imperfect piece of technology: the snorkel. This device, a retractable air intake and exhaust pipe, was a double-edged sword. It allowed the U-boat to run its diesel engines while just below the surface, charging the batteries and refreshing the air without fully exposing itself. But it was a clumsy, noisy contraption. The head of the snorkel, barely breaking the waves, could be spotted by a sharp-eyed lookout or a primitive radar set. Worse, a malfunctioning valve in rough seas could instantly flood the boat, sending it plummeting to the crushing depths. It was a lifeline that could turn into an anchor at any moment. It was with this fragile hope that Commander Scheffer initiated one of the most audacious and controversial feats in submarine history. He ordered the boat down and gave the command to remain submerged, continuously, for the entire passage of the North Atlantic. This was the birth of the legend of the 66 days. For over 2 months, the crew of U-977 would not see the sun. Their world shrank to the diameter of a pressure hull, a 150-foot-long iron coffin. Life became a monotonous, waking nightmare. The snorkel was their mechanical lung, but it came at a cost. The roar of the diesel engines, running for hours every day, became a permanent feature of their existence, a deafening, bone-jarring vibration that made sleep a luxury and conversation a chore. The air was a thick, recycled soup of carbon dioxide, oil fumes, and unwashed bodies. Condensation dripped incessantly from the cold hull, ensuring everything and everyone was permanently damp. Hygiene was a forgotten concept. Fresh water was rationed for drinking, leaving none for washing. Beards grew wild, uniforms became stiff with grime, and the single toilet often failed, adding another layer of misery to the already unbearable stench. Time itself became meaningless. Day bled into night with no sun or moon to mark its passage. The only rhythm was the changing of the watch, the roar of the diesels, and the quiet hum of the electric motors. The psychological strain was immense. Men who had been trained for the sharp, violent terror of combat now faced a far more insidious enemy, a crushing, endless boredom that gnawed at the soul. They were trapped in a sensory deprivation chamber, cut off from the entire human race. Their only connection to the outside world was the periscope, but raising it was a risk Scheffer was rarely willing to take. They were ghosts, existing only to themselves, fueled by dwindling rations and the single, desperate hope of a new life under a southern sun. The audacity of the plan was matched only by its cruelty. A self-imposed prison sentence served in the deep Atlantic, and this was only the beginning. As the weeks ground on, the geography of their misery changed. U-977 crept south, a blind mole digging a furrow through the ocean's dark soil. The icy chill of the North Atlantic, which had seeped into their bones, gradually gave way to a suffocating, tropical heat. The steel hull, once perpetually cold and weeping with condensation, began to absorb the warmth of the equatorial waters. The submarine transformed from a damp refrigerator into a sweltering pressure cooker. Temperatures inside soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and with 90% humidity, the air became a hot, wet blanket that was impossible to breathe. Men moved sluggishly, their bodies slick with a permanent layer of sweat and grime. Sleep became a series of brief, delirious blackouts in pools of their own perspiration. It was in this floating furnace that the boat itself began to die. The strain of constant nonstop operation was taking its toll on the aging machinery. The first major blow came without warning. Deep in the engine room, a catastrophic failure occurred in the starboard diesel. A sickening shriek of tortured metal, a final shuddering groan, and then silence. One of their two iron hearts had seized. Panic for a fleeting moment was a live thing in the cramped compartment. They were now crippled. With only one functioning engine, their ability to recharge the batteries was halved. Every hour spent running the remaining diesel put an immense strain on the overworked machinery, bringing them closer to a total breakdown that would leave them dead in the water. The chief engineer and his exhausted men worked miracles with little more than hand tools and sheer determination, but they could not raise the dead. The starboard engine was gone for good. Their journey, already impossibly long, had just become significantly longer and infinitely more dangerous. The snorkel, their flawed savior, continued to torment them. On multiple occasions, the head valve, battered by unseen waves on the surface, would slam shut unexpectedly, starving the roaring diesel of air. The engine would then begin to suck the atmosphere from inside the boat itself, creating a terrifying vacuum. Men would gasp for breath, their ears popping violently as the air was literally pulled from their lungs. The frantic seconds it took to shut down the engine felt like an eternity. On another occasion, the opposite happened. The valve failed to close, and a geyser of cold seawater cascaded down the intake pipe, flooding the engine room floor and shorting out electrical panels. The boat lurched, alarms blared, and for a few heart-stopping moments, it seemed their voyage would end in a short-circuiting, sinking wreck. Food became an obsession and a torment. The last of the fresh bread grew a green fur of mold. The sausages became hard, greasy lumps. The diet devolved into a monotonous rotation of tinned meats and dried peas, all of it tainted by the taste of diesel fuel that permeated everything. Weevils infested the flour. The drinking water stored in the ballast tanks grew warm and brackish. Every sip was a reminder of their slow decay. The men themselves were wasting away, their bodies weakening, their resolve tested with every passing day. They were no longer the disciplined sailors of the Kriegsmarine. They were 32 ghosts, trapped in a failing machine, held together only by the quiet, stubborn leadership of their young commander and the shared, unspoken belief that any fate was better than surrender. By the first week of July, U-977 was a vessel on the verge of total collapse, not from enemy action, but from within. The men had been pushed beyond the known limits of human endurance. Their skin was pale and covered in sores from the constant dampness and filth. Their eyes, accustomed to the dim, artificial twilight of the submarine, were hypersensitive. Muscles had atrophied from lack of use. Psychologically, they were ghosts, haunted by the ceaseless drone of the machinery and the crushing isolation. Commander Scheffer knew his crew was breaking. The legend he would later write, of an unbroken 66-day submerged odyssey, was a story forged for the public. The reality was messier, born of desperation. He had to get his men into the sun and fresh air, or he would arrive in Argentina with a crew of corpses and madmen. The risk was enormous. They were in the South Atlantic now, a vast and seemingly empty expanse of ocean, but Allied shipping lanes still crisscrossed these waters. A single sighting would end their journey. Yet the danger of implosion from within was now greater than the danger of discovery from without. On July 14th, 1945, after more than 2 months sealed in their tomb, Scheffer made his decision. He chose a remote spot near the Cape Verde Islands, far from any major routes. The command was given: prepare to surface. The familiar hiss of venting ballast tanks was the sound of resurrection. The submarine, sluggish and heavy, tilted upwards. For the men below, the angle of the deck was the first sign that their world was about to change. Then came the shock of daylight flooding down the conning tower hatch. It was a physical blow, painfully bright, forcing the men to shield their eyes. But nothing could prepare them for the air. The first breath of fresh, salt-laden wind was a revelation. It was clean, pure, and intoxicating, scouring their lungs of the recycled poison they had been breathing for weeks. It was the smell of life itself. One by one, the skeletal, bearded men climbed onto the deck, blinking like creatures born in darkness. They saw the sky, an impossible, infinite dome of blue. They saw the sun, a searing ball of fire that warmed their pale skin. They saw the ocean, not as a terrifying, crushing weight above them, but as a sparkling, living surface stretching to the horizon. It was a sensory overload that brought some men to their knees. For a few precious hours, U-977 became an island of humanity. They anchored in the calm, tropical water. The men, shedding their foul clothing, dove into the sea, the cool salt water washing away 2 months of accumulated filth. They shouted, they laughed, their voices thin and strange in the open air. It was a primal, joyous release. Lookouts were posted, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a reminder that their freedom was fragile and temporary. But for this brief interlude, they were not fugitives. They were sailors enjoying a day in the sun. They undertook frantic repairs on the deck, mending what they could, their movements clumsy but determined. They were breathing again, not just with their lungs, but with their souls. This pause was a strategic necessity, a calculated gamble to restore the crew's sanity and the boat's failing systems for the final leg of their journey. Whether the 66 days were a single, unbroken stretch, as the legend claimed, or a series of impossibly long dives punctuated by this one desperate gasp for air, the reality of their suffering and the scale of their achievement remained undiminished. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, the time came to return to the depths. The order was given. The men, their skin now pink from the sun, descended back into the familiar steel tube. The hatch was sealed, plunging them once more into artificial light. The ballast tanks flooded, and with a final lingering look at the world, U-977 slipped beneath the waves, its brief flirtation with life over. The final, longest part of their journey had just begun. The brief taste of freedom off Cape Verde was a powerful medicine, but its effects were temporary. As U-977 continued its silent, submerged crawl southwards, the old miseries returned with a vengeance, now amplified by the memory of the sun and open sky. The final 5,000 miles of the journey would be a slow, grinding descent into a new kind of hell. Their destination, Mar del Plata, Argentina, was a name whispered like a prayer, a mythical paradise at the end of a long, dark tunnel. But with each passing week, it seemed to recede further into the distance. The single remaining diesel engine was now the absolute center of their universe. Its every cough, sputter, and change in rhythm sent a ripple of anxiety through the entire crew. The engineers treated it not as a machine, but as a dying patient on life support, coaxing it, nursing it, listening to its labored breathing with the focus of a surgeon. They knew that if it failed, their options were grim: drift helplessly until found, or scuttle the boat and take their chances in a rubber dinghy in the middle of the world's widest ocean. The psychological toll of this mechanical uncertainty was immense. Every man aboard became an amateur engineer, his ears tuned to the faintest sign of trouble. Paranoia became a constant companion. The boat itself seemed to be actively trying to kill them. Rust, fed by the relentless humidity, bloomed across every surface. Electrical systems, never designed for such a prolonged, continuous voyage in a tropical climate, began to fail. Short circuits would plunge sections of the boat into absolute darkness, leading to moments of heart-stopping panic, until a crewman with a flashlight could fix a corroded connection. The food situation grew dire. They were now consuming the last of their emergency rations, hard biscuits that felt like chewing on rocks and tinned meat of questionable origin. Malnutrition began to set in, bringing with it lethargy, dizziness, and a dulling of the senses. Men who had once been strong and fit were now gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their movements slow and deliberate. To conserve their dwindling supplies and reduce the strain on the life support systems, Scheffer implemented a brutal routine of forced inactivity. Men were ordered to remain in their bunks for as long as possible, forbidden from moving or talking more than absolutely necessary. The U-boat became a silent crypt, its inhabitants lying in their bunks like corpses, conserving every calorie, every breath. This enforced stillness was a unique form of torture. The men were left alone with their thoughts in the hot, suffocating dark. They thought of home, of the families they had abandoned, of the war they had lost. They began to question the decision they had made in that Norwegian fjord. Was this desperate flight to freedom worth the price of their sanity? Was the uncertain welcome in Argentina better than the known quantity of a prisoner of war camp? Tempers frayed, arguments erupted over trivial matters, magnified by the claustrophobic conditions. Scheffer, ever watchful, had to become a psychologist, as much as a captain, quelling disputes, offering quiet words of encouragement, and maintaining the fragile thread of discipline that held them all together. He was a 24-year-old man carrying the weight of 31 fragile minds on his shoulders. The world above them had moved on. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final surrender of Japan was imminent. The great global conflict was drawing to its true and final close. But in the silent, timeless world of U-977, history had stopped. They were men out of time, fugitives from a war that no longer existed, sailing a ghost ship towards a future they could only imagine. Finally, in the second week of August, after more than 3 months of relentless transit, the instruments indicated they were approaching the coast of South America. The news spread through the boat not with a cheer, but with a palpable wave of exhausted relief. The end was in sight. But their arrival would be anything but simple. Scheffer now faced a final, complex challenge: how to surrender a German U-boat to a neutral country 3 months after the war had ended. He couldn't simply sail into the main harbor of Buenos Aires. Such an act would create a massive international incident and guarantee their immediate handover to the Americans or the British, the very outcome they had crossed the globe to avoid. He needed to make contact carefully, to control the narrative of their arrival. On August 17th, 1945, 107 days after leaving Norway, U-977 surfaced in the murky coastal waters off Mar del Plata, a major Argentine naval base and seaside resort. The boat rose from the depths like a sea monster from a forgotten age. Its hull was a mess of rust and marine growth, a testament to its incredible journey. The conning tower was streaked and weathered. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a derelict, a piece of oceanic wreckage that had somehow, miraculously, stayed afloat. The crew, emerging into the sunlight for only the second time in 3.5 months, were a shocking sight. They were emaciated, with long matted hair and beards, their skin an unhealthy, almost translucent white. Their uniforms were tattered rags. They looked like castaways, not soldiers of a disciplined navy. Their appearance alone told the story of their ordeal. As they approached the harbor entrance, they were met by an Argentine patrol boat. The initial contact was tense. The Argentine sailors stared in disbelief at the German U-boat, a specter from a conflict that was now a chapter in the history books. Through a signal lamp, Scheffer communicated his peaceful intentions and requested permission to enter the port and intern his vessel and crew. The news of a German submarine's arrival spread like wildfire through Mar del Plata, and from there to the rest of the world. By the time U-977 was guided to a naval pier, crowds had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and awe. Reporters scrambled to get the story, their cameras flashing. For a world that was beginning the slow process of healing and forgetting, the sudden appearance of this phantom from the war was a shocking and sensational event. It was as if a ghost had materialized in broad daylight. The Argentine authorities, caught completely off guard, placed the German crew under guard. The men of U-977, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in over 3 months, found their legs unsteady, their senses overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells of land. Their epic voyage was over. They had made it. They had crossed 7,600 nautical miles, endured unimaginable hardship, and arrived at their promised land. But their ordeal was far from finished. The arrival of a rogue U-boat in Argentina was not just a local curiosity. It was a geopolitical bombshell, and it would throw a fresh spark onto the smoldering embers of 1,000 conspiracy theories that the war had left behind. The international reaction to U-977's arrival was immediate and explosive. While the Argentine public was largely intrigued, the Allied powers were furious. For them, this was not a story of remarkable seamanship. It was a brazen violation of the terms of surrender and a deeply suspicious event. Argentina, officially neutral during the war, had long been accused of having pro-Axis sympathies. The arrival of not one but 2 U-boats months after the war's end, U-530 had surrendered at the same port just a month earlier, seemed to confirm the worst fears of Allied intelligence. Questions flew across diplomatic channels. What was this submarine doing? Who or what was it carrying? The crew was promptly separated from their commander and handed over to the United States and Great Britain for interrogation. The gaunt, exhausted German sailors who had dreamed of a quiet life in a new world found themselves not in paradise, but in sterile interrogation rooms, facing hardened intelligence officers. The interrogators were not interested in their tales of hardship. They were hunting for secrets. The primary theory was that the submarine had served as a Nazi taxi, ferrying high-ranking officials of the fallen Third Reich to a safe haven in South America. The most sensational rumor whispered in intelligence briefings, and splashed across tabloid headlines was that U-977 had carried none other than Adolf Hitler himself. Despite the Führer's confirmed death in his Berlin bunker, the myth of his escape persisted, and this ghost ship's arrival provided a tantalizing, if baseless, piece of evidence. Scheffer and his men were questioned relentlessly for weeks. Their logs were scrutinized, their personal effects searched, their stories cross-examined and picked apart. The interrogators were professional and thorough, searching for any inconsistency, any slip of the tongue that might reveal a hidden cargo of fugitives or gold. Yet, under intense pressure, the crew's story remained consistent. They were simple sailors who had fled out of fear of retribution, not conspirators in a grand escape plan. Allied intelligence officers scoured every inch of the submarine itself. They stripped the paneling, checked the bilges, and inspected the torpedo tubes, looking for any sign of hidden compartments or unusual modifications. They found nothing. There was no evidence of extra passengers, no trace of Nazi treasure, no secret documents. There was only a filthy, worn-out submarine that reeked of diesel and despair, its condition a testament to the crew's harrowing account. Then came a more sinister accusation. On July 4th, 1945, the Brazilian cruiser Bahia had exploded and sunk with a catastrophic loss of life. The cause was a mystery. Now, with the appearance of U-977, a convenient culprit had emerged. Allied investigators, particularly from Brazil and the United States, were convinced the U-boat had violated the surrender terms and committed a final, atrocious war crime. Scheffer and his officers were accused of murder on the high seas. This was a charge that carried the weight of a death sentence. Scheffer vehemently denied the accusation. He presented his ship's log detailing their slow, submerged journey far from the location of the Bahia's sinking. He insisted they had fired no torpedoes after the surrender. For a time, the world believed the U-boat was guilty. The story of their incredible journey was eclipsed by the shadow of this alleged atrocity. It took a painstaking investigation, including testimony from the few survivors of the Bahia, to uncover the truth. The cruiser had not been sunk by a torpedo, but by a tragic accident. During an anti-aircraft training exercise, a live shell had struck a rack of depth charges on the ship's own fantail, triggering a massive, instantaneous explosion. U-977 was innocent. Slowly, reluctantly, the interrogators came to accept the simple, unbelievable truth. There was no conspiracy. There was no Hitler, no gold, no secret mission. There was only a 24-year-old commander and his loyal crew who had undertaken one of the most extraordinary voyages in maritime history for the simple human reason of fear. With the conspiracy theories debunked and the accusations of war crimes disproven, the world's interest in Heinz Scheffer and his crew began to fade. They were no longer the central figures in a global mystery, but merely the final, inconvenient footnote to a war that everyone was eager to put behind them. After months of intense interrogation in American and British custody, the men of U-977 were finally, quietly released. Their dream of starting a new life in Argentina, however, was not to be. They were repatriated to Germany in 1946, returning not as heroes or villains, but as ordinary men to a country that was a landscape of ruins and ashes. They melted back into the civilian population, their incredible story known only to them, a private epic of suffering and endurance. The submarine itself met a more definitive end. After being thoroughly examined by Allied intelligence, U-977 was sailed to the United States, becoming a brief curiosity for the American public and a subject of intense study for the U.S. Navy. Naval architects and submarine engineers pored over its design, particularly the snorkel, which had enabled its long submerged journey. It was a piece of enemy technology to be learned from and ultimately surpassed, but its value as a tool of research was finite. By November of 1946, U-977 had served its final purpose. Off the coast of Cape Cod, the old U-boat was designated as a target. The submarine that had survived the Atlantic eluded the entire Allied fleet and endured 107 days of self-inflicted hell was now floating empty under a cold American sky. A single torpedo, fired from the U.S. submarine USS Atoll, struck its hull. There was a flash, a plume of smoke and water, and the veteran Type 7C, which had been a home, a prison, and a sanctuary for its 32 men, broke apart and slid beneath the waves for the last time. Its final resting place is the deep, cold water of the Atlantic, the very ocean it had so audaciously conquered. For a few years, the story of the longest voyage seemed destined to be forgotten, a strange but minor incident in the grand sweep of the Second World War. But Heinz Scheffer was not content to let his and his crew's legacy disappear. In 1952, he published a book titled U-977, detailing the entire journey from his perspective. The book was a sensation. It transformed the forgotten U-boat commander into a best-selling author. His account, which solidified the legend of the 66 continuous days submerged, captured the public's imagination. It was a raw, compelling story of human resilience, of men pushed to the absolute brink in the face of impossible odds. It tapped into a post-war fascination with tales of survival and adventure, and it offered a rare, humanizing glimpse into the lives of the men who had served on the losing side. The book cemented the voyage of U-977 in the annals of naval history. It became a case study at naval academies, examined not for its strategic importance, it had none, but as a singular example of leadership, seamanship, and the profound psychological stresses of long-duration submarine operations. The legend of the ghost ship that defied the world had been born. Today, the story of U-977 endures, occupying a unique space in the history of the Second World War. It was a journey with no strategic impact. It fired no torpedoes in anger, sank no ships, and changed the outcome of no battles. Its mission was born not of military orders, but of a deeply human cocktail of fear, pride, and a desperate desire for self-preservation. Yet, in its own way, the voyage is as compelling as any great naval engagement. It stands as a stark monument to the sheer force of human will. The decision made by Heinz Scheffer and his 32 men in that Norwegian fjord was an act of profound defiance, not just against the Allied powers, but against the logical end of history. They refused to accept the final page that had been written for them. Instead, they chose to write their own epilogue, a grueling, almost unbelievable tale written in diesel fumes and rust across 7,600 miles of ocean. The legend of the 66 days submerged, whether factually precise or an embellishment born of memory and pride, almost misses the point. The true marvel was not in the specific number of days spent without sunlight, but in the collective fortitude required to endure such an ordeal at all. It was a psychological experiment conducted in the most extreme laboratory imaginable. A cramped, failing, stinking steel tube lost beneath the sea. Every man aboard was pushed past the breaking point, stripped of everything but the core instinct to survive. They endured mechanical failure, crippling heat, near starvation, and a crushing isolation that would have broken lesser crews. Their survival was a testament not to the quality of their machine, which was an outdated relic, but to the resilience of the human spirit. The voyage of U-977 serves as a powerful reminder that history is not just made in the grand clashes of armies and fleets. It is also found in the quiet, desperate struggles of individuals confronted with impossible choices. It is a story about the gray areas of war, where the lines between duty, defiance, courage, and fear become blurred. It was not a heroic last stand, nor was it a sinister conspiracy. It was simply the final, arduous chapter in the lives of a small group of sailors who, having lost a war, chose to navigate their own peace on their own terms on the longest and loneliest voyage home.